Conflicts are a part of our life. They cannot be avoided, they cannot be completely eliminated, but it is possible to live with them in a civilized and peaceful manner. In the podcast series called Conflict Matters, we talk about what conflicts can take away from us, but especially about what they can enrich us with if we are not afraid to think, listen to others, and discuss.
Welcome, everybody. Radicalization of young people represents several types of conflicts in a society. We in PDCS work on understanding conflicts, and we are trying to help people to live with them in such a way that conflicts may move us forward and bring us a new quality in our relationships. However, radicalization, as we see in recent days in Slovakia, unfortunately, usually leads to very destructive aspects of conflict. And it goes hand in hand with violence, hate, and wish to destroy and harm people, communities, or even institutions, or democracy as such. And today we will talk on conflicts that are related to radicalization and are related to family problems, are related to problems going deep into the society. And I'm very happy to welcome here our friend and colleague, Shannon Foley Martinez. And Shannon is a social worker and a person who is really successful in work with radicalized youth. And she has a record of helping more than 100 people out of radicalized or extremist groups or movements. And she has very touching personal history, being a part of this kind of movement in her young age as well. She's mother, grandmother, wife, and a community member, and all these aspects of her personality you will have chance to know. So Shannon, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy my time with you. It's always interesting and challenging. I appreciate very much the work that you do and for inviting me into that work.
Shannon, you were telling your story several times in Slovakia already, but what I would like you to tell us is that because you are breaking the stereotype, usually people think that radicalized youth, those are people from dysfunctional families, poor or with some deep problems within the family, but you were not the case like this. So how it happened with you? Why did you, the young lady from a good neighborhood and good white family, how it happened in your life?
It's one of the, it's one of the only values that I see in even like sharing my personal story is sort of this idea of challenging the stereotypes of people who of the people who are actually at highest risk and the stereotypes that we have about who is actually at highest risk. Obviously, like another very stark thing that stands in the face of that is that I am a woman. And most people do not associate, especially the violent far right, as being something that women are even potentially really drawn into. I grew up in a family where my parents were married. They're still married. They've been married for over 50 years at this point. And they were upwardly mobile middle class. They had both come from like working class families, but were the first generation to begin to make the crossover into like white collar work, that my dad was training and working as a mechanical engineer in the nuclear power field. And they were the first generation where like anyone went to college and sort of like made that crossover. From the outside, my family looked very idyllic. It looked very, I was born in 1974, so I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. And definitely from that cultural perspective, like everything looked really great in my family. I was very active in sports and athletics. I'm 5'2", so I didn't play basketball for obvious reasons. But pretty much if it was a sport, I played it and I was probably really good at it. I was in, special classes for like gifted and intelligent kids. My parents were actually, active in the things my brother and I did. I had an older brother. He was 2.5 years older than me. He was also very active in school and extracurricular activities and things like that. But on the inside of my family, things were incredibly dysfunctional. For me, my earliest memories were that I was like the black sheep in my family. I remember being a very little girl, 4 or 5 years old, and just thinking like, I don't belong here. Like, this is not my family. I came wired really differently from everyone else in my family.
Why was it like this?
Yeah, and like from very early. And I think like part of what made me like that was that I wanted to know why things were the way that they were. Later in my life, and when I went to university, I had professors who were just like, Shannon has this very mathematical, scientific, inquisitive mind. And I was like, what are you talking about? But it made a lot of sense. And for me, it's like, it was really important for me to understand why the rules were what they were. And instead of just being like, because we're done being parents for the day and we're tapped out, like go play in your room, that they're just like, just because we said so. And for me, I like resisted that from when I was very, very, very young. And because of that, I was always in conflict with my family. Additionally, I feel like now as parents, we have so much more information out there about parenting and about healthy emotional learning and things like that. But in my household, the rules like changed all of the time, depending on the emotional state of the parents. So it's like something that would be fine at 11 o'clock during the day, like jumping down the stairs or something like that. By like 6 o'clock at night, when the adults were tired and worn out, like that would be a punishable offense. And so for me, I really had difficulty understanding what the expectations were. I knew I was supposed to be perfect, but I didn't know what perfect meant because it was changing all the time. And I never really felt like safe in my household because I never knew like when the adults were going to become angry or agitated, and something that was fine was now going to be something where I would be yelled at or punished for, or whatever. But I had a bunch of like coaches, and I lived in a neighborhood that had a lot of families. So I had lots of other adults in my life who did feel safe, who I could understand like how to navigate through this. But when I was 11, we moved from where we lived just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to rural southern Michigan. So, about 1,000 miles away, and went from very urban suburban to very rural suburban living. And when I got there, this sense of not really belonging inside my family expanded out into the greater world. That like when I got there, I didn't have the same hair as everyone. I didn't listen to the same music. I didn't dress the same. And the kids, like, because I had such a Philadelphia accent, that they were just like, are you from England? Like they thought I was from like a completely different country just because I had an accent that was really different from theirs. And I did make some friends, and I was still playing sports once we moved. But there was this sense in which now I really was an outsider. I was 11 years old and going into early adolescence, and the job of early adolescence is to begin to grapple with your identity. Like, who are you going to be in the world? And who are you going to be separate from your family? What things are you going to take from your family and the identity they've given to you? What things are you going to reject? What things of your own are you going to put in to your life? And for me, because I felt I had this like outsider status, I was really drawn to like countercultures and subcultures. And the first subculture that I was really drawn to was 1960s like protest and anti-war culture. And so I started listening to like a lot of 1960s like music, reading books. It was during that time, it was the 1980s. So the first generation of like Vietnam War literature was coming out. I began reading a lot of the like first person accounts of the Vietnam War. I wouldn't understand until much later, just like several years ago, really. I was always really drawn to war literature, and I was just like, what, why do I feel? And then I was like, oh, it's trauma. I was like, oh, this is a world that makes sense to me. But it took me a really long time to like piece that together. I'm like, why have I read enough like war literature to get a PhD? But I still and then it hit me. I was like, oh, it's because the trauma that I have experienced like really resonates. Like that's a worldview that makes a lot of sense to me.
Sorry, I will interrupt you and ask more in depth, because what I hear is that trying to belong somewhere and feeling that you are outsider, you are this black sheep, that this is the moment where the adolescent is very fragile and open to various influences. But if we take it like that, so every teenager would become radical person, right? So what else was there? What made you really like feeling very, very bad in this new neighborhood and in your family? Was it like no dialogue, no connection with your brother and your family, or that really it was like all people were showing you that you are different, or why it was in your case?
I think for me that it was, very much this like confluence of events where my brother and I were actually pretty close growing up. When he left to go to high school, he kind of distanced himself from me, and just sort of like did his own thing. And he actually like really struggled with like alcohol abuse and stuff. Like he was valedictorian of his class. So he graduated first of his class in high school, but struggled with like alcohol addiction throughout his adolescence and early adulthood and stuff like that. So there were indicators that he was also struggling in our household, but in a different kind of way. And again, I think, my parents were still involved, but as I started exploring subcultures, it's like my appearance got more and more radical because like through 1960s anti-war culture, I ended up landing in the like punk rock scene. And did crazy stuff to my hair. And that was sort of this first time that I was like, oh, my physical appearance has power. Like I can like upset people just by what I look like or whatever. And my parents like really, really hated it and hyper focused on that, which just for me was just like, okay, I just want my appearance to be more radical just because, I'm like, I have innate worth and value just because I'm here and I'm me. But you can't see that because I have purple hair or whatever. So that was the first time in my life that I wasn't playing sports and I didn't really have adults in my life that I could develop healthy relationships with. When I was 14 years old, after my first year of high school, I went to a party right before summer. And at that party, I lied to my parents about where I was going. And when I got there, I started drinking. By the end of the night, I would be sexually assaulted by 2 men. And when I woke up the next day, my first thought was like, did that really happen? I was like, okay, yeah, it did. And then my second thought was like that there was absolutely no way that I could tell my parents. Now, like part of growing up in my household is that anytime my brother and I were like hurt or sick or whatever, anything that made the adults feel out of control and powerless, that their first response was to yell at us. Like, how many times have I told you not to play barefoot outside? How many times have I told you not to climb trees like that? And then eventually there would be like comforting and stuff. But the first instinct for them was to like yell at us and blame us for our own injuries or illnesses. And so I think there was this protective part of me that was like, you can't deal with what just happened to you and also deal with them blaming you. As an adult, I've gone back to like talk to them like, hey, now that you know the rest of the story, like, what do you, and still they're just like, well, you kind of were asking for it. You were drinking at that party. And, and I'm just kind of like, okay, like in a lot of ways that was a relief because, it wasn't based on an illusion that 14-year-old Shannon had. But because I didn't have any adults in my life at that point, I didn't have anyone to talk to. And it was before the internet. So I couldn't even just Google like, hey, Google, I was raped. What do I do? There wasn't good, dissemination of information in terms of like hotlines or anything like that to do. So I took all that completely unprocessed and shoved it down. And the main way that came out was in deep self-loathing. I hated myself. I hated my body. I felt like trash. And the main way that was being expressed was through rage. I hated myself and wanted to hurt myself, which I did. And I wanted to just like hurt and destroy everything and everyone I touched. Because I was hanging out in the punk rock scene, on the periphery were the like white power skinheads. And they've got in fights at every concert. They all always kind of had each other's backs. And I think this like rage within me really resonated with the rage that they displayed. And I remember having the explicit thought, like, who's worse than the Nazis? Like, they have to take me in. That I felt so worthless that I needed a place where I didn't have to be any good to belong. That a lot of people are like, oh, if a baseball coach or, you know, a soccer coach or somebody came along, but not me, because I felt like I was so worthless. I didn't go anywhere. I had nowhere that I belonged. And so I needed a place where I just had to show up as in the skin I was born in, and where my, you know, propensity for fighting and destruction was seen as an asset. And so I started hanging around with those guys more and more, started listening to the music that they listened to, started reading some of the books and literature that they were reading, learned like some of the conspiracy theories and the language. And over the next like 4.5 years, essentially built like a physical echo chamber. I would move all over the United States and live with different cells of white supremacists throughout the country.
Again, I would interrupt here because what I hear is that maybe you refer to Christian Picciolini, who is very often saying that in that time when he was very angry as a youngster, also for being different, he's saying, if at the time the ballet teacher comes to me, I would maybe become a ballet dancer. And you are saying, no, it's not like this in your case, that this trauma was like inside of you and the hate was necessary for you to cope with this trauma. Was it something like the addiction on hate or the violence, which was helping you to somehow cope, and through being bad, you tried to create some value for yourself? And sometimes I think that, of course, we cannot draw sharp lines like, okay, this is the way how to deal with it, and every situation is very specific. But was it like, if that time when this tragic event happened to you, if there is somebody whom you could talk to openly and freely, that the things would be different?
I think too, for a very large percentage of the people who I have mentored as they have left, that they also expressed this idea that it's like they felt like they didn't really go anywhere, like that they felt valueless by the time that they ended up like, you know, radicalizing. I often frame this as like, so you have all these vulnerabilities. And for me, my very strong working hypothesis is that very much of the precursors for radicalizing to dehumanizing violence are things like adverse childhood experiences, known as ACE scores. So these things that, you know, happen, they're not necessarily like big T trauma. Like for me, sexual assault is trauma. Like big T, it is trauma. But there's also, we're growing in understanding of like complex trauma, of developmental trauma. So living in a household where you don't feel safe, where the emotional lives of everybody in there are very sort of like unstable and unsafe or whatever. And so as these traumas layer on top of each other, that we know from the science surrounding trauma, that as trauma layers, that people become susceptible to all kinds of less than optimal outcomes. Like even like in adulthood are more likely to have physical ailments, or more likely to have involvement with intimate partner violence, whether as the perpetrator or as the victim. They're more likely to have addictions and all of these other things. So you have these vulnerabilities, and the way that I have been thinking about it is that it's almost like an accident of timing and geography. So what does a vulnerable person at a particularly vulnerable point in their life collide with? In my case, it was really unlikely that I would radicalize into violent white supremacy, that it had to happen in a physical space. I had to meet another human being. I had to have a physical copy of like a book or a CD or a record put into my hands. And that was incredibly unlikely that that would actually happen. Now, however, it's everywhere. Pretty much 100% of young adults and young people who have an internet connection will absolutely positively collide with violent, far-right communities, comments, content, like online, or, you know, other violence and other dehumanizing ideas and communities, whether that's, you know, misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic, whatever that is, that it is pretty much a certainty that that will happen.
Shannon, and you were talking about acceptance or lack of acceptance within your family and within the community. And this is also very interesting that maybe even now in the society, let's say our Western culture, where we are really very much oriented on measuring the success by what you do, what's your grade at school, what kind of school you're going to, and what are your results in sports or other Olympics in various subjects at school. So that also, what do you think about also this environment? On one hand, they have access to all the possible evil coming out from internet. On the other hand, this problem of acceptance is something I think worth of discussing, because what I hear is that with this pink hair and with this appearance changing and being provocative, actually you as a youngster provoked them to notice you, to accept that you are able to make with your body things which they don't agree with, but they had to accept it because they could not change it.
I think that makes a really, really good point too. You know, for me, as you were talking, the word that comes to my mind is meritocracy, right? So it's like that we're given messaging that we have worth and value based on what we produce or what we do, you know, rather than this idea that we have like innate value simply because we exist and we are here and we are us. That it's like these external markers of worth and value, right? So that is also happening at the same time that these other things are going on. And I think meritocracy is very prevalent in America, for sure, that is something that is everywhere. People have bumper stickers about their kids' grades in elementary school. I'm just like, they're in second grade. Like, why are you taking like credit for your kids' A's? I don't know. It's second grade. Like, doesn't even matter.
Yes. And is it reflected, at least in some circles, also in the United States, that this is actually something wrong we are doing, and especially in context of coronavirus, a pandemic, and them staying at home and watching too much stuff on the internet? This approach, this meritocratic approach to adults, to communities, even to children, that it's a problem because it can generate the conflict, the intergenerational conflict or value-based conflict, really, that who has a value and why this person has a value. Is there any kind of reflection going on in the US?
You know, all these markers of like worth and value are being removed and stripped away. And I think that really creates a vulnerability of like, okay, well, how do I find meaning in my life? That one of the things that I, even as a child, like I was very passionate about wanting to make the world a better place, that I felt like I was put here to do great things. And that is something that echoes through a lot of the stories of people who I've mentored as they've been disengaging. That this Dr. Ari Kruglansky frames it as a quest for significance, right? And so it's like inside these, you know, violent and hate-filled communities that a lot of people find that sort of like, oh, well, my life inside this framework can be important, that I have not found a way to make my life significant out in the greater world. But here, me being here and me being me actually really matters and makes a difference. And even if that means like giving up my life for that, well, that actually adds significance to my life, that dying for this cause or the potential or illusion of that as being a potential reality or whatever, that actually increases the idea that there is significance to your life and what you're doing. And for me as a woman, it was a very highly misogynistic place. And I, endured like brutal, physical abuse from all of the partners, nearly all of the partners that I had while I was involved. A lot of talk to like very strict like gender roles. And at the same time, there was a lot of talk of like, okay, like women are these sacred vessels to bring forth the new white nation and the keepers of like hearth and home and the passers on of tradition and all of that stuff. But were treated incredibly badly by all of the men that were there. But because I felt so worthless, that didn't challenge my thought. I was like, okay, whatever, it's like, but by extension, it's like, if you're willing to use that violence against me, you're also willing to use that violence against my enemies and people who are potentially going to hurt me. At least in this dynamic, I know like it's sort of predictable or whatever. And at the same time, it was this idea of this adjacency to power, that it's like I had dated people and stuff before I was involved, but once I was involved, it was like, because there were so few women who were like all the way in, and I basically like dated whoever was like the leader of wherever I landed or whatever, and had like some influence and power that way that I did not feel or experience in the outside world. That I was kind of like, I wasn't unpopular, but I wasn't like super popular. And I didn't really feel like my voice like mattered very much, even though I was involved in student government in school and stuff like that. It was like, I was actually like president of my student class when I was 15. So after I was sexually assaulted and went back to school, I was actually elected like president of my class. But by that point, it was like I was already on the trajectory of like radicalizing and was like really not doing very well at all, like personally, and ended up leaving school. And, I left home for the first time when I was 16 years old. So I was already like not doing very well, but I didn't feel like my voice really mattered there. But inside this echo chamber and inside this sort of, world, that I felt really important.
But yeah, you had then various other problems and experiences with moving there and there of your family and you escaping. But the most important moment, of course, probably everybody's waiting for the other part of the story. Who was there, or what was the moment where you started to think about your life the other way? Because I know the story, I can ask directly, why was this person, or in what features was this person so different from the other adult people you met in your life, that suddenly with this person you felt accepted the other way, not through hate, not through violence, not through conflicting, but the other way?
When I was like just about to turn 20, I ended up not really having a place to live. I was dating a guy who was involved in the far right, who was in the army, which so like very much not a new problem. And my parents had kicked me out because I would leave and come home. And at the time I was like living with my parents, but they were just like, you gotta leave. Like, you're an adult now and we don't have to take care of you. And I didn't have anywhere to go because he was in the army. I couldn't go live with him. Very luckily for me, his mom said that I could go live with her and her 3 younger sons. That was like in Texas. I was living in Georgia at the time. That was in Texas. So again, another traverse of, about 1,000 or more miles across the country. But when I stepped off of that bus, and walked into that door, several things happened very immediately. The first one is that my echo chamber was broken up. That now that I was living with a family with, this mom, and she had 2 11-year-old twin boys and a 9-year-old boy. I was living, I was spending, most all day, every day in that household with them. That my echo chamber is broken up. She had no reason to take me in and just did so anyway. So it was like I had a genuine belonging where I didn't have to prove myself through espousing any ideology or my willingness to like fight or, go do vandalism or, do hate crimes, on synagogues or mosques or whatever. Like, I just had to like do the dishes sometimes, maybe like help babysit or whatever. And also, it was like I began developing a relationship, particularly with those little boys that we would play out, we'd play catch outside, we'd go fishing and camping. I was reading them, like books at night before bed. And it was kind of like I started to having these feeling like, I don't want these guys to like be involved in what I'm involved with. And so then there was this conflict. Well, why not? Like, if I believe that this is like the truth and this is something that I'm willing to die for and feel like that would be a meaningful death, why don't I want them to be involved? And at the same time, like listening to music that I had continued to listen to and being like, wow, this is kind of like the absolute antithesis of everything that I'm doing. Why does this music resonate with me? And like, which one of these things like has to go? And I had continued to read literature and poetry and things like that throughout my time, like while I was involved, and I was just like, how can I be this person who is so filled with rage and hate and anger, and at the same time weep at how beautiful language can be, reading poetry, like this idea of like, how can I hold these two divergent realities within myself all at the same time? And so it was in that space where I began to really like disaffiliate and distance myself from far-right ideology. One of the other things that I think is very crucial that happened, and is something that I utilize very often in my own mentorships for people who are leaving, is that this mom didn't just say like, hey, don't you want to like pull your life together? It's like, and she didn't know that I was involved in like white power stuff. Like, she just thought I was this sort of like edgy teenager, just didn't understand what I was involved with.
And what about your appearance? Did you that time looked like very strange, and did she accept it how you look like? Did she ask why your hair is this style, or how was this?
I mean, like, I walked into that household, very typical, like, skinhead girl. There's only a handful of pictures of me from that time that have survived. I look like the gruff and angry, like, creature that I had become. Just, like, shaved head, wore my boots and braces, and, like, to see someone like me show up on your doorstep and be like, yes, come be part of our family. I mean, I do that in my household, but I do that because that was given to me. Like, the idea that I looked the way that I did, and she was like, hey, why don't you come be part of our family, was just revolutionary for me. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't like, oh, you need to change this. But as I was disaffiliating, I did start like growing my hair out. I did start, dressing sort of, more normal. There's weird things too, that because this all happened during my teenage years, like, there's stuff that I'm just like, I don't know, my hair, and I'm so bad at wearing shoes because I like wore, Doc Martens and boots and stuff the whole time. I was just, luckily I have daughters who are now like grown up and adults and stuff, but that they were like, Mom, you can't wear that. Like, that doesn't make sense fashion wise. I'm like, thank you. I missed this part of my teenage years. So I appreciate your input on this. But this woman also, like, she tangibly connected me with things that would help me move my life forward in a positive direction. That I had dropped out of high school, but she was like, don't you want to go to college? And, and then beyond just saying like, oh, you should go to college, was like, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you need to find out what the entrance requirements are. And again, it's before the internet. So she's just like, well, let's go to the library and we'll get addresses and we'll write, you can write them letters. She made sure there was a stamp on them, put them in the mailbox, took me to go take entrance exams, made sure I had, a pencil, drove me to them. It wasn't just that she was like, you need to fix your life. It was like, if this is something you want to do, I am going to help you. And I'm going to help you by like putting you in my car and physically giving you the materials that you need in order to begin to take the steps forward. It was probably a process of about 4 to 6 months where I was like in this process of like disaffiliating and distancing myself from that. And then, probably around the like 6, I was just kind of like, that's just not really part of my life anymore. But I still had all this unprocessed trauma. Like for almost 10 years, the way I framed what happened to me when I was 14 was just like, oh, I lost my virginity to 2 men at a party when I was 14 years old. That it would take the birth of my oldest son when I was 23 years old to just be like, oh, there's a word for that I was raped. Like this was not, I didn't just like lose my virginity or whatever. That it took me, having my own children and seeing like, oh, wow, like I really need to deal with the trauma that I've experienced. I have skills and tools I desperately need to learn. Like I don't know how to raise my kids, but I know I don't want to raise them the way I was raised. I know I never want them to grow up and be like me. I never want them to look to hate or violence as a viable expression of anything happening in their lives. Like, how do I cultivate human beings who thrive? What does that look like? My oldest just turned 25, and we're still all very much a work in progress. He and I joke that it's like the great experiment.
How many children do you have?
I have 7. I have 7 kids from 25 down. The youngest is about to turn 7. And I just had my first grandbaby at the very beginning of September. So that's a whole new experience. But it's also been very emotionally moving for me, looking at my daughter having the start that she's had through her like birth and like through her pregnancy and her birth and just in these early weeks of motherhood, and how starkly different that is from my own, where I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Yeah. I'm trying to like do things, like wear my baby and breastfeed and like, all this stuff. And like seeing her get to begin from this very empowered place where she has the skills to ask for help when she needs it, and also the confidence to like find her own way through kind of failing, and watching her and her partner be able to have, really those intense conversations. And if you ever had a tiny baby in your house, you know how intense that time is, and watching them navigate through that in a way that is just leaps and bounds from where I began. And so like that has been incredibly emotional for me. In addition to like I have a big grandbaby, a baby in my house that I can give back that I don't have to take care of.
But that's a wonderful bridge in the story that you now working through online and through personal contact with teenagers who have similar problems as you had when you were young. You are educated, experienced worker in this, and you already started to compare what's different today, because of course you did not have access to internet and to all the information and all the social networks and echo chambers within the internet bubbles. But also we have had this coronavirus period where young people were stayed at home, isolated only with their computers, and many other problems arrived. So what is now the most important thing to deal with in your country, let's say, or in the region where you're working? What do you see are the most important problems of young people who are vulnerable to radicalization and to falling into really like such a level of desperation that they need conflict, they need hate, they need violence to prove themselves that they are worth something?
I unfortunately think that several years from now, we will look back at COVID as really like a flashpoint. I think that it's sort of like an event horizon in terms of radicalizing to violence and dehumanization, and the confluence and the timing of that inside in America, inside the political realities that are happening, in which the mainstream right has increasingly embraced what used to be sort of like fringe ideas of far right, that this mainstreaming of far right talking points, conspiracy theories, everything as subsumed by the mainstream right. So the right in America, the mainstream right has gotten more and more right. The mainstream left has actually not gotten further left, that they've stayed pretty static. And the mainstream left in America, in most like European countries, would actually probably be center, probably even like a little right of center in terms of, political spectrum stuff. But so there's this growing divide between the mainstream like political parties and stuff like that. So that's also happening. And I think with COVID and not just like the isolation, but the stress that families felt, the burnout that families felt during that time, we are in the middle of a recession. And I know it's always very interesting to me in America, the economists will be like, oh, everything's fine and the economy is strong. And meanwhile, everyone that, is working for a living or whatever, we're just like, gas is so expensive, food is so expensive, basic housing is expensive, your gas, electricity, like those things, like that everyone I know is really struggling. Most people I know have changed how they eat because food has become so incredibly expensive. And so I think with all of these things that we will look back and just be like, wow, it was, sort of this incendiary device inside, very favorable conditions for ignition. And I think for young people, one of the things that I hear over and over again is that they feel really hopeless about their future and their ability to impact the future, right? And we depend on youth to be change makers and movement makers, right? Like so often when there has been social progress, that the bodies that have been on the ground have been the youth who have been there. And I feel like at this point, especially in America, people have lost faith in the political process. They don't feel like their voice you can like just undo like a whole election or whatever. So I think that hopelessness is like really rampant, and that there's not a lot of messaging out there that is offering any hope that like counteracts that or whatever in any sort of substantive way.
Yeah. So what we can do to cope with this, even maybe on a community level or on a family level, is there any approach that you feel that works? Of course, we have heard already about acceptance, about maybe strength to express that I am not so perfect, and being accepted with all the imperfections as a family or as an individual, that even we are like maybe not so successful as we look on Instagram or on other social networks. But is there anything else, or are there any tools which you now are offering to young people how to cope with this world and this situation where things are really changing so rapidly and there is really a lot of hopelessness from the top to down of the society?
So I am a huge proponent of like whole of society approaches, right? Like looking at hate and dehumanizing violence from a public health framework, and that there need to be intervention points all along the whole trajectory. One of the things, how I sort of like frame things, that in addition to like our basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, water, that we, no matter how much the world changes, we as human beings don't actually change very much. Like we still have the needs that we have, right? And so for me, it's this idea that we have 3 essential needs beyond like our physical needs set or whatever, that we all need to feel truly seen and truly heard. We need to, feel like who we are as we are is valued, that we are seen, and that we are heard. And the second thing is that we all need to feel loved and able to give love. It's not just enough to be able to feel like you have love. Like if you look at the incel community or whatever, like their biggest struggle is that they feel like they have all this love to give, and nobody wants it. So it's not just enough that we feel loved, but also that we have others that we feel like we can give our love to. And that the third essential need is that we have an empowered, meaningful connection to something greater than ourselves. And this idea that this connection to something greater than ourselves actually gives us agency in our life, in our world, that it is not just like I'm a part of something. It's like helping you see that you are, on this continuity of human existence, but that you being involved and part of that matters, right? And so that can be through, religious traditions or like community traditions. So for me, the main things that I focus on and think about are, from a personal standpoint, is helping young adults and young people have a more empowered time online. So helping them to understand that everything is marketing and interacting with everything that they're doing online as something that is being marketed to them, and helping them to identify, manipulative content online, and just developing the skill set of being like, okay, like whose opinion has the right to matter in your life? And that like not everyone's opinion has the right to matter, that they have to earn the right for their opinion to matter in an ongoing way. And so like this content or whatever, it's like, well, have they earned the right for their opinion to matter in your life? They're just random people like on the internet. If you can identify that can help you encounter this material and these communities in a more empowered way. Looking for the ways that manipulative content impacts you. That we know from other studies surrounding like food and stuff like that, that young adults and teenagers and young adults, that if they are taught how they are being marketed to, that they are able to affect and impact change in their lives to embrace healthier habits in a much more long-term and profound way. And especially like teenagers they don't want to be manipulated, right? They just want to be like you, so you're tapping into this innate sort of, drive that's there for teenagers to want to see the truth. However, so much of the marketing that's used from the bad actors, from the far right and stuff like that, that they are presenting themselves as the people who are telling the real, that they're like, here's the truth that you haven't had yet. And we have this like special truth, which then is incredibly appealing to the youth because they're just like, yeah, I don't want to be manipulated. And then coupling that with emotional learning, that we know like even just learning how to name the emotion that you're feeling has a therapeutic effect, that it changes what you're feeling. So teaching kids to like, how is what you're reading making you feel? What is the intention? Is this targeting the hopelessness that I feel? Helping yourself to identify your emotional responses to things online, and knowing that, like the way that scrolling through your phone uploads a bunch of dopamine into your brain, and that the confirmation bias that we have, identifying that in real time, and that it's not just things that we're like, oh, heck yeah, totally agree on that it's also things by which we feel outraged, that we get, injections of pleasure hormones into our brain when we are outraged, either, very positively or very negatively, and helping to better identify that as a time like, okay, I'm responding incredibly strongly to this. I probably need to get some more information before I go all in on this or whatever. Yes. But learning how to, not just scroll, but identify and utilize your emotional life and your body's signals to you, because for me and my generation, that we think of like being online as just like, this sort of like brain activity, or like it's not, but it's like, it's a very physical activity in which like we have a lot of stuff going on in our bodies as we're scrolling through all of this. And I think too, the other part, the big part of that, the meta part of that, is empowering and modeling how to build resilient and strong communities. And what does that look like? Do we even know our neighbors' names? Do we even talk to them? Do we know everyone that lives on our street? what are the things that we all have in terms of resources as a neighborhood? Like, is somebody growing some food? Is somebody, like whatever, like thinking about our very local neighborhoods and how we can build stronger. And the first, because the antidote to hate isn't love. The antidote to hate is connection. It's incredibly hard to hate people with whom you have a personal connection. And it doesn't even matter if that person falls within the scope of, like, if you are very anti-Semitic and you might be violently anti-Semitic, but if your neighbor is a Jewish person that has helped you out, like, you will make an exception for them. They will become this exception. So they're not included in that group of others because you have a connection with them. And so really focusing on building strong and resilient communities, getting young people involved in service to the community, like what's happening for the unhoused people in your neighborhood? Where are the needs that are there? What can you go out and do together as a family or as groups of neighbors to find meaning in, like, doing some of this service work, but that also helps you feel like you matter in the continuity of where you live, but making it very hyper-focused so that you really feel like your actions and involvement have agency. It's not just like, I'm part of a movement, yes, but you're like, no, I'm doing this.
No, but also the communities, also in Slovakia, some right-wing extremist people, they are doing community work, but they can do it exclusively. That they are just doing community work for decent people, that means white and Slovak ethnics, and for all the others, it doesn't matter. So how to change this to make this community work also inclusive, that not to expel everybody who doesn't belong to my worldview. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Sometimes, it also can be kind of toxic, this community work.
Yes. And one of the challenges that I have, in talking to parents, because for me, I'm just like, the very first steps of prevention are like having a very trauma-informed approach to your parenthood, doing away with things like meritocracy. And in America, from very young, having conversations about race that include whiteness, right? And so white people are like, but I don't know how to do that, and I'll wait until my kid is older. And it's like, even though we know scientifically, from studies that are out there, that children of whatever race internalize messages about race by the time they're 3 years old, that even young Black children will choose white depicted dolls and things to play with, that there's anti-Blackness is so prevalent in American messaging that it's part of who you are from when you're really, really young. And for a lot of people, when they encounter the far right communities, that it's the first time that they've ever had or heard conversations about race that include whiteness. And they're just like, yeah, it is okay to be white. They've had conversations about race, but never that included whiteness and what that means or whatever, or it's never included a discussion about ethnicities or whatever, or their own ethnicity. And so it's the first time that so many people are encountering these things. And you can do that in a way that, it doesn't need to be high level stuff, but even just beginning to have conversations about that when you're watching television with your kids, reading books, ensuring that whenever possible, that there are experiences that are multi-ethnic or multicultural or pluralistic that are there. And communities have a lot of power to decide what happens in their communities. And I think that it is something that is woefully underutilized, certainly in America, and I think in Slovakia as well, where it's when Nazis show up, when the bad people show up, that you don't just cede the streets to them. You don't just cede to them their influence in a community, that you show up together, and it doesn't need to be violent or whatever, but you show up together to just be this is not what our community is. And we will not, you are not welcome here. And we insist on this other way. And that does take bravery, that does take courage, but it is effective.
Yeah, that's true that we need to somehow break these stereotypes or break these boxes where sometimes everyone put in, and they are built from stereotypes. But my last question would be, coming back to conflicts. Do you also teach or mentor your clients and the families how to deal with disagreements and conflicts within the family, within the community? Because these differences, would it be intergenerational or in between various cultures, ethnicities within community? Of course, it brings conflicts, different values, different interests, and even situations or characters or temperaments. Are there also a part of your work to give them some tools to work with conflicts constructive way?
So for me, because of the work that I do, that I have to listen to a lot of people who have really, really terrible, terrible things to say and terrible ideas, right? And so this ties into, again, like this sort of like emotional skills building that is there as well. Where it's just like this idea of like, okay, when I am interacting with someone, even if I find what they have to say absolutely despicable, am I genuinely listening, or am I there trying to like change their mind? Mm-hmm. Right. And, you know, one of the things that I talk about a lot is like, it is okay. It is essential. Like, if you are going to engage in any kind of like dialogue with anyone, to have boundaries, to know the language that is and isn't okay for you, to know when you have to like personally walk away from that conversation. We're actually really bad at doing that. And and we become outraged and all these other things when we could have been like, hey, look, you know, using that racial slur is not okay with me. If you do that again, like, I have to end this conversation for now. Like, we can come back to it later, but that's a no-go for me. Mm-hmm. But we're not very skilled at doing that. And instead, like, you know, become outraged. And then there's this conflict that sort of begins, you know, continues to erupt. So the very first thing that I talk about is like, like navigating through and trying on and figuring out what your boundaries are in terms of what you will accept in terms of conversation. And that's going to be really different for everyone. Like, my boundaries are much like broader with the things that I will listen to, because I am listening so often to people who are coming out of really violently far right spaces. And they're not just going to go from there to like peace, love, and harmony or whatever. So they still often have very, you know, like politics and things that I really disagree with. The other thing that I talk about too is listening for the stories behind the stories that people are telling. That everyone has gotten to where they are and to the belief systems that they have through whatever has happened in their life up to that point. And beginning to try to listen to like, okay, well, what's the story for how someone got here? Because again, my working hypothesis, and there's begun to be some studies around this in terms of like far right stuff, that a very large percentage of people who become involved have multiple layers of trauma in their life. And so if you can understand that, and that this is like this expression of this stuff that has happened to them, that changes a little bit like how it doesn't make it okay, but it's like, okay, well, if we can begin to address some of the things that led you here in the first place, maybe we can then, you know, create a space where you can make different choices and that you don't feel afraid and under threat all of the time. And you are not like as impacted by the idea that there are others to blame for why you're not thriving or whatever. And if you can find nothing else, like, to me, like, it's so vitally important, and it's so difficult to do, particularly when so much of this happens online, is to insist on the humanity of the people with whom you're interacting. Even if they have completely inhuman ideas and actions that they have undertaken. It doesn't mean that you have to say that their beliefs or actions are okay. That is not what I am saying. But to steadfastly hold that this is a fully human person who is expressing this to you, and insist radically on the humanity of others. That to me, radicalization isn't the problem. Extremism isn't the problem. Like if you climb Mount Everest or, whatever, like that's extreme. Radicals brought us like work protections and the end of slavery in America and things like that. The problem is dehumanization, hate, and violence. Primarily, dehumanization is the biggest problem. When we see those who fundamentally disagree with us or who are engaged in particular things as less than human, then we interact with them completely differently and to our own demise and the demise of like our entire communities. And so for me, it's this idea of, that even if I disagree with someone completely on something, trying to ask them and focus on like, okay, the things that really make us human, like what are you afraid of? A lot of times we'll be like, I'm afraid my family isn't going to thrive, my children won't have opportunities, that we're going to be unsafe. And it's like, okay, well, I feel those things too. I can relate to you on that level, on this very basic, like we all want our families to like be okay. We want to feel a sense of safety. We want our kids to have opportunities or whatever. And so even if our politics or the things that we believe or the actions that we choose to engage in are completely divergent, that almost always you can find somewhere that in their humanity that you can connect together, and you might not change their mind or whatever, but you have had this very humanizing interaction both for yourself to maintain that you continue to treat people as humans, but also that it's like, okay, I've talked to people about gun control and things like that, and I never had a conversation where somebody wasn't just yelling at me. Like we disagree completely, but they get to walk away with this like, oh, maybe I have like pegged everyone who doesn't agree with me about guns as this like radical person or whatever, but I just had this interaction with at least this one person that humanizes that interaction going forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Shannon. This was very important, I think, at the end to say about humanization and about this skill to listen to somebody genuinely and find the basic humanity in everybody. And this is also for me the message to talk to somebody without the intention of changing their mind is very important. We feel it in everyday situation. I think that very often people pretend to listen, but they actually think about what they have to say and how they will argue with us. So this is something we have to remind ourselves every day. Thank you very much, Shannon, for your interesting story and for the wisdom you bring us, because it's also possible to use, I think, in Slovak circumstances and in our European space, because as you mentioned, these problems are pretty much global, with meritocracy, with dehumanization, with inability to cope with differences and to cope with trauma and conflicts in relationships and in communities, and too much concentrating on performance, on some measurement of success in material sense, and too less taking care of ourselves and our relationships. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and spending time with me. It's always, I learn stuff every time too. I appreciate the work that you do. Thank you for including me in it.
Conflict matters. It can destroy and hurt, but it can also bring a new quality into our lives. Thank you for being with us.